Today's emergency episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We partner with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their community. And in 2022, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action, give hope and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also presented to you by Maurice Blackburn. Maurice Blackburn's Dust Diseases team have accumulated more than 20 years of experience in asbestos litigation and pride themselves on ensuring that their clients not only receive the best compensation result, but that they are supported during their stressful and traumatic time. And Maurice Blackburn are looking for a passionate full-time associate to join their Dust and Diseases team in their Brisbane office in sunny Queensland. To apply, go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that's out every Friday, except for today, that dives into the progressive campaign issues and the people leading them from home and abroad. We normally punch out our episode on Fridays, but this Saturday is a South Australian state election. South Aussies go to the polls. We did a preview episode maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago with Adelaide Advertiser journalist Michael Maguire. A poll came out overnight in Adelaide on the Adelaide Advertiser-YouGov poll that has Labor now leading on a two-party preferred basis. I know it's only 2PP, but their statewide primary is pretty decent. It's got a 4 in front of it, which is great. We don't have seat level polling, but certainly things are looking good for Labor. It is competitive, and that's an incredible achievement by both Peter Malinauskas and the Labor team over in South Australia. So we thought we would do another podcast just before election day and get it up as soon as we possibly can, as opposed to putting it out on Friday afternoon. So we're joined on the call today by the former federal member for the seat of Adelaide and a former minister in the Rudd and Gillard governments, and now an author. Kate Ellis will be on the show today just to unpack the campaign so far and what we can look to expect on Saturday night when polls close at 6 p.m. Central Summertime. Don't forget to subscribe to the show if you are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Stitcher. And if you like the show, be sure to give us 5 stars, no less, on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. When you're done listening to today's episode, leave us a review. And to follow us for all the updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday afternoon on Wurundjeri land in downtown Melbourne, and joining me on the line from Adelaide is the former member for the federal seat of Adelaide and the author of the best-selling book, Sex, Lies and Question Time, Kate Ellis. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the last time we had you on the show, you had just launched your book and you were flat out doing your book tour. How did that all end up?
It's been good. It's kind of, obviously there was some COVID pauses in there, but it's kind of ongoing in dribs and drabs. I've got another Writers' Festival coming up, and obviously there's an increasing focus as we move into the federal election on issues not just of the federal parliament, but particularly of women in the federal parliament. So I accidentally stumbled across an issue which turned out to be bigger than I thought it would be when I was writing the book. But, you know, it's important, and if it helps bring about change, then that's great.
We did a podcast with Michael Maguire, writer and a former staffer for the Labor Party, but now writer for the Adelaide Advertiser, at the start of this campaign to preview it. But things are going so swimmingly well, certainly on the polls, and I'm pretty excited about Saturday that I wanted to do another preview just to sort of get us really super focused and talk about what's happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign and what can we expect on Saturday. So let's just dive in. Obviously, there was a news poll a YouGov Adelaide Advertiser poll that came out this week. Did that come out today? Is that right, or yesterday? When did that?
Yeah, it came out last night, so it was in the papers this morning, but there was a fair bit of phone calls and texting being made when it went online at about 8 o'clock last night.
I feel like it would have sent palpitations through the hearts of those in the Liberal Party headquarters. Maybe, I'm sure if it's matching up with their own private polling, then maybe it wasn't palpitations straight away, but certainly affirming what some people had already believed. Labor now leads on a two-party preferred basis, 56-44, and their primary vote is now 41 to the Libs 33. Your initial reflections on this poll as we head into the final days of the campaign?
I think, to be honest, it probably sent some heart palpitations through Labor supporters and Labor insiders as well. I'm sure that I'm not the only one that's still a bit scarred from polling in previous elections, and particularly the last federal election. So I think, if anything, people are really reinforcing the need that we can't get complacent and we can't rely upon polls. I don't mean to, sound like a politician saying there's only one poll that matters, but I do think we're taking it with a grain of salt, that there's work to be done, there's votes to be won, and people are really focused on that. But there are some pretty extraordinary figures in that poll, and I think, for me, particularly the preferred premier, to have an opposition leader leading as preferred premier by so much, and particularly in a time when normally I think the conventional wisdom is that in times of crisis or uncertainty, people want to stick with stability and stick with the government. So that is an extraordinary result for Peter Malinauskas personally. But, things look good, but they're statewide polls. What we don't know is what's happening in the individual seats, and that's what we're going to have to wait till Saturday night to find out.
I want to ask you about those two things you just raised there, starting with Peter Malinauskas. Yeah, you're right, that approval number is excellent for a first-time opposition leader, 51% satisfaction. Daniel Andrews didn't get anywhere near that when he was the opposition leader going to the 2014 poll, so that is absolutely incredible, and particularly given the background of what's been going on over the last sort of 2 years with COVID. I think everyone's just been thinking about that. What do you put that down to? What has Peter and the campaign done well? I mischievously wanted to say, is it because he's embarked on a "Suns Out, Guns Out" kind of style campaign?
I don't think that that's hurt him, but no, I wouldn't put that down. I think the one thing that, Peter Malinauskas is now the only state opposition leader who was there pre-COVID and is still standing, and he's played it very differently to other opposition leaders. And I must say, particularly in your home state, we've seen from here, when we look at Victoria, we've seen the opposition, criticising, critiquing, throwing punches the whole time. And I think that, at least here in South Australia, Peter has instead been trying to be constructive and has been quiet during some of the COVID decisions, as have his front bench, because they've kind of recognised that people want the state to do well. People want to get through COVID. People want the people in leadership positions to make the right decisions. So unless it is clearly a wrong decision, then they've been supportive in a way that I think has been really constructive. And the other thing I'd say is Peter's probably done the work in terms of just building trust. He's really rational, sensible, likeable, and so he's managed throughout the whole 4-year term to kind of build those relationships through the media, through the community, but particularly also with all of the major lobby groups. He's spent a lot of time and I think won a lot of support. People, even if they're not Labor people, I've heard from so many Liberals in the last few months that they really respect Peter and they think he's a good guy and they don't think he'd stuff it up. And that's pretty important as an opposition leader.
It was one of the things I loved so much that I saw on Twitter a couple of weeks back, a post from Peter with a photo with a bloke. And it says, "Today I had lunch with my Liberal Party opponent in the seat of Croydon, Michael Santagata. Michael is a very decent man who reached out to catch up with me, and I'm really glad he did. He talked about, what motivates them and their shared values, and even though we don't agree on everything, it's just great to see the fabric of democracy alive and well. If I was, first of all, I think it's I want to get your thoughts on what that speaks to in terms of Peter's personality and the way he's approached this campaign. But if I was the people at Liberal Party headquarters, I would be effing raging. If one of our candidates went and did that, I would just be so pissed off. But what does that talk about in terms of Peter's own personality?
Well, I think the thing about Peter is he's authentic, and I mean, Adelaide is a small town, so we call it a city actually, but people know if you're being legitimate or not, and that is one example of, I think, why people like Peter. I mean, I've known Peter for 20 years. You probably have similarly. And I've never heard anyone say a bad word about him. Like, one of the things that we were talking about at home last night that is important, Peter has played footy for one of the local footy clubs for 20 years. You know, he's played 200 games, and apparently he always buys his direct opponent a beer after the game. Now, if you do that for 20 years, you've got a lot of people going home at night telling their friends and family, you know, this is what happened during the game, but yeah, I stood against Peter Malinauskas and he was a good bloke. You know, this just adds up. Like, Peter is actually a good, genuine, nice guy who's also really smart and impressive. But the example you gave is of no surprise to anyone because it's completely fitting with the character that a lot of people know, or if they don't know personally, have heard about.
Unpacking some of the figures from that YouGov poll, and we'll go through a couple of them, but the one of them that stood out to me before, and I just want to pick up on that remark you said about him reaching out to lobby groups and stakeholders and small and big business. On the issue of cost of living, 30% nominated it as their most important issue, and of those 38%, they said that Labor would be better managers of cost of living than the Libs. I think it was 38% Labor, 28% Liberal. That's remarkable, given that it should be strong, favourable turf for a Conservative party or government. What is that down to? What's going on there?
Well, I think there's a few different factors. There's the fact, you know, people have done it tough. People have done it tough everywhere as a result of circumstances in the last couple of years. One of them, though, I think is the restrictions on business that happened during COVID. You know, some of them have had absolutely massive impacts on small business owners as well as big business owners. And I think that, you know, the difference that we have here in South Australia is that last year we had our borders closed. Unlike other parts of the country, we didn't have COVID in the community, but we also had some of the strictest restrictions on business and trading. And I think there's a lot of people who felt that the pain that they were feeling, there was a question over whether that was justified at the time, but there was a bigger question over whether or not the government cared. There was just a lack of support, a lack of action. You know, I've got a mate who, you know, owns a small bar, and it's just about been wiped out. You know, when you can't stand up and have a drink, when you're operating at a tiny capacity, businesses have been hitting the wall, and people are really struggling. And I think that Peter's done a really good job of sitting down, listening to them, and trying to work constructively on solutions. And I mean that matters. Your point about it not being a traditional Labor constituency. You know, the business leaders have come out publicly. We've had Business SA, you know, our local Chamber of Commerce, come out publicly saying that they really enjoy working with Peter Malinauskas. They've found him constructive. We've had the Master Builders Association come out speaking favourably. So in terms of the traditional divide of politics, I think a lot of that has been turned on its head by the circumstances of COVID. And I think Peter's managed that really well. I mean, I don't want to talk as if this is one. Nobody here thinks that this is one and that this is, you know, all the reasons why Peter Malinauskas has conquered SA. He's still got 3 days of work to do. But this is the reason why the polls are so favourable towards him, and why, regardless of the outcome of this election, I think he's won a lot of respect really broadly across South Australia.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, the broad orthodoxy of this race should not be competitive. A one-term Liberal government isn't something that you'd expect voters to do.
Yeah, I have a view on that as well. That, I mean, the Liberal government have tried to run against the previous Labor government. Labor was in power for 16 years. You're right, we've had one term out. And I think that that's been misjudged, because normally you could do that. You could run after 4 years, they haven't learnt their lessons. But this has been a really long 4 years for a lot of people. Like, I think when you think back to 4 years ago, it seems like a lifetime ago for a lot of people. Like, a lot has happened. And I don't think that's hit the mark. Of people don't see the current Labor opposition as the same team that was the Labor government for so long. But it would be extraordinary if there was a change of government after 4 years. That would be a remarkable result. And it's amazing that we're even talking about that as being a real possibility. Is particularly given South Australia has not fared as badly, was not hit as hard by COVID as most of the rest of the country. So it's a bit different, the dynamics down here.
Let's talk about health, because it seems to be observing it from across the border, it seems to be a central issue that has been there's certainly been run by Labor. I can't get a sense of what the Conservatives are running on, but that poll said that 39% of respondents nominated health and hospitals as the most important vote deciding issue for them, and that Labor was best to manage that. At the start of this campaign, would you have thought that health and hospitals would be the dominant issue of the campaign? And what has Labor done to make it such a critical central component to their campaign narrative?
I would have predicted that at the start of the campaign. I think that, COVID's put a spotlight on the health systems across the country like nothing else has. And so if you're talking about COVID, it's a short walk to talking about the health system and how well we've fared and what the capabilities are. So I think it is a really big issue, and Labor's really run with the health issue, not just talking about health, but talking about priorities. They've used it to highlight that they have priorities, that they believe in something, and to question whether the current Liberal government do. And, the most powerful example of when that really hit home was at the end of the first week of the campaign, the Sunday Mail, our local newspaper, ran an article on both of the major parties' pledges that day. And from Labor, it was a major health spending announcement to open hundreds of additional hospital beds. And, it actually read, in contrast, Premier Stephen Marshall has announced $7.5 million to upgrade the giraffe enclosure at the Adelaide Zoo. So I think, the issue of health in itself is critical and something that is really important, but it's also been used to show that Labor stand for something and have a plan. And the Liberal campaign has been a bit all over the place in, lying out what their priorities and what the narrative that they're running on is. But, giraffes, there might be a big vote in it. I'm not sure.
It's a sleeper. I think some really shit joke about what do I put my head above the parapet or anything. What is the central narrative to the Liberal campaign? Because that's something I just can't seem to put my finger on.
Well, I think if you ask the Premier that, he'd say that he believes we have a stronger economy, that we're building jobs, that we're attracting companies. That's what the Premier would say. I would argue that's not what the Liberal campaign has been focused on. Their campaign has really, I think, overwhelmingly been focused on the Labor opposition. It has been trying to bring up the record of the previous Labor government, which, as I said, I just don't think has hit the mark. Or it has been increasingly in the last few days, or the last week in particular, it's been questions about where's the money coming from. Labor's throwing around money. We actually had the Treasurer out a couple of days ago with fake money, just throwing it around, suggesting that that's what Labor was doing. So I guess it's that traditional attack on economic management and being able to run the budget. But I would have to say, I think it's one of the most negative campaigns I've ever seen from a government, and particularly from a first-term government. It has been much more focused on Labor than on their record or on their plans or on the future.
I feel like Mallee and Labor have got in their heads early. Someone told me privately that they think the Libs brought their negative ads out super early, just because obviously they've read something into either their research or what have you, that they've realised, shit, we need to rough up Malinauskas here. I think I personally think that you don't talk about your opponent, particularly if you're a government. Like, why don't mention their names? I mean, no wonder Mallee's approval ratings is at 51%. The government keep talking about him. I mean, what's going on? Is he in their heads?
I don't know the answer to that. I've spent a lot of time, particularly in the first few weeks of the campaign, trying to work out what the strategy was behind the Liberal campaign and whether there was something really clever going on that I couldn't see, or that maybe it was just because they were focused so much on the ground campaigning that, it wasn't, I live in a safe seat, so I wasn't seeing a lot of it. But I don't think there was. I think they had a terrible start to the campaign. I think they've done better in the last couple of weeks, in that some of their negative attacks, I think, have hurt a little bit more than anything they were throwing around at the start of the campaign. But I mean, one of the other questions I think is, when you look at the Liberal government here, they've lost a large number of MPs and ministers during this one term. And in fact, I would say that the person who has done the most work during this campaign is their treasurer, who is not recontesting. So he's got 3 days left of the job, but he's been doing the heavy lifting in putting out all the negative attacks, in running all of that. So I don't know whether they're down on personnel, just because they have lost a number of MPs, they've lost ministers, they've had people step down, they've had people leave the Liberal Party and are now running as independents. And maybe they just feel like they don't have the people on board, and they're fighting on so many different fronts at the moment that they're stretched a bit thin. I don't know. It's been a really strange campaign. Maybe if they get away with it, then we'll all be saying on Sunday it was brilliant. But at the moment, I think a lot of people are shaking their heads. They're all scratching, thinking, what exactly is going on here? I don't know.
Amazingly, only 8% of voters in that poll nominated COVID as their most important issue. And the article in the Tiser supposed that incumbency, particularly this sort of COVID incumbency, that was such a boon for the Queensland and WA Labor governments in 2020 and 2021 elections, and they did so well out of it, is over. And that governments in general should now not just assume because you're in government that you should be able to be swept back into power. What's your thoughts on that?
I think the timing has definitely worked against the Liberal government here. I imagine if this election was last year, even towards the end of last year, it wouldn't have been a contest. But the mood changed, and I think the mood changed across the country when it came to COVID. It went from people really hoping that our leaders would make the best decisions and would guide the way and would see us through, and people willing to give them some benefit of the doubt and put their faith in them, to I think people increasingly just got over it and got angry about it and were just sick of it and lost patience and started getting more critical about the way it's been managed. Certainly in South Australia, because we didn't really have COVID last year, it would have been an easy election win for Stephen Marshall and the Liberal Party last year. Their timing was hurt by the fact that we happened to open our borders just a few days after Omicron and have more cases than we've ever had previously, over Christmas, over the summer holidays. So the number of people who were already tired of restrictions or tired of quarantine, tired of lockdowns, who then had their summer holidays ruined. We've also had the strictest rules around close contacts. We haven't followed the national definition of close contacts. So people are being locked in their houses regularly. And until a couple of days ago, we also had in any other part of Australia, I understand if you test positive, you're in 7 days isolation. In here until last week, it was 10 days. So we've had more cases than we've had previously. And people are saying, why am I locked up for an extra 3 days than anyone around the rest of the country? I'm assuming that it's not any infectious for any longer here. So there's been some consistency issues and people have just lost their patience, I think. So, yeah, the timing's worked really badly for him.
Extending upon that question about incumbency, what federal implications do you think live in this election result? To your point before, we don't know what's going to happen yet, but even if it's a close race, if you're Scott Morrison, what are you thinking ahead of the poll that's happening in May?
I think to some extent things are a bit specific to SA here, but I actually think Stephen Marshall has not had posters of Scott Morrison around the electorate. He's not highlighting Scott Morrison. I don't think he thinks that Scott Morrison, he's got John Howard in town today, but we haven't seen the same, Scott Morrison hitting the airwaves and going and doing supermarket walkthroughs. I think the thing is that the federal government actually have a whole lot of extra issues, which Stephen Marshall has never had. The federal government have got, obviously, the floods and the way that's been handled. I think the anger about the vaccine rollout sits really firmly with the federal government. So I think they carry a lot more weight. I think they've got more problems than Stephen Marshall.
Let's talk about the. You made a point early in the podcast about the this poll that's come out, which is only it's only a two-party preferred and a statewide primary. There's a nuance about South Australian elections that I think that sometimes we across or outside the great state of SA aren't aware of, and that is you can win elections with an incredibly low primary, and in some cases even a two-party preferred that can be below 50%. There are critical seats, and Labor was very good at campaigning in that scenario. That's why they were in there for 16 years. There are 4 or 5 critical seats that we talked about in the podcast last time: King, Elder, Newlands, Adelaide. Seeing out if there's any others. What sense do we have about Labor in those actual battleground seats? What are we seeing on the ground there? We think that we feel confident, or are we competitive? Is it a contest? Are we doing all the right things there?
Well, I guess, some of those seats, the seat of Newland, for example, 54 voters is all it takes to change their mind, and that becomes a Labor seat. So the margins are really thin on the first 3 seats. Then it gets a little bit harder. Elders out to 555 voters have to change, and then there's a big leap after that if you want more seats. So the seat that I've spent the most time in recent weeks is the state seat of Adelaide. So 219 voters need to change. Our candidate just got out of isolation yesterday and her daughter tested positive for COVID. But I will say this on the record. Our candidate, Lucy Hood, has worked harder than I think I've ever seen a candidate work. And it was really smart that she was pre-selected early. She has been out there on the ground for pretty much 2 years. And out at pre-poll in recent days, I've never seen the level of candidate recognition that Lucy's got in any candidate, except perhaps a celebrity candidate when they're brought in. But she has knocked on doors. She's met everyone. When you approach them, they say, oh, yes, we've already spoken to Lucy. We've met her here. I think that has been a remarkable campaign. And interestingly, I think it's also a campaign that's been led by women in terms of the campaign manager, all of the key staff, the volunteer manager. They're all these amazing, enthusiastic women. And that campaign has got an energy that I think you really rarely see. Now, I've seen that up close because I've been a tiny bit involved along the way and tried to show my support. But I think in terms of those first 4 seats, you'd be pretty confident of, I'll call Adelaide. If Lucy Hood doesn't win Adelaide, then you've all heard it first that I have absolutely no political radar. But I mean, one example was when I was at the pre-poll the other day, I had a Liberal volunteer who was there supporting the local member. And he had done for decades. He supported the Liberal Party, but he quietly said to me, "Oh no, I think this seat's already gone for us. That Lucy Hood, she's been everywhere, and everyone really likes her." So it's been a really good on-the-ground campaign, not just over the last few weeks, but in seats like that for a number of years. Similarly, in the seat of Elder, which is a bit harder for us, but still critical, our candidate ran at the federal election for the seat of Boothby. So many of them are the same doors, they're the same community groups, they're the same people. So there's a level of familiarity that some of those candidates have developed, which I think will be helpful, hopefully. I think the caveat I'd put on trying to pick seats, I think there's the most unusual dynamic in this South Australian election that I can remember seeing, and it makes it more unpredictable than I think elections normally are. And that is that a whole lot of the people that are really angry with the government are the traditional Liberal supporting business community. They're a lot of the people that have been the most vocal, a lot of the people who are furious with the Premier and who will badmouth him around town. Are people who have either been involved, supported or voted for the Liberal Party previously. And conversely, I think some of the people who would like to give Stephen Marshall the benefit of the doubt are probably the mums and dads, out in the suburbs who just want everything to be stable and manageable so that they can try and get on with their lives and have some sort of normality. So there's this strange dynamic because I don't know whether those business people, when it comes to the ballot box, are actually going to do something they haven't done previously or haven't done very often, and that is actually vote Labor, or whether they've just been blowing off steam, and vice versa. So there's people lining up in really non-traditional areas to what you would normally assume were the party's main constituencies. So it just makes it really unpredictable.
It's funny just listening to you talk about that. There is a number of similarities between the 2014 Victorian state election campaign and this one for SA Labor. The issue of ramping and the ambulance campaign and using the same sort of campaign, some of the same campaign tactics anyway, with the chalk on the glass of the ambulance vehicles. A lot of people in the business community in Melbourne in 2014 were walking around going, who was this government that we elected in 2010? We thought we were going to get a good old conservative, Liberal government, and they just are not opening the doors to us. They don't give a shit about us. So we're going to have a look at Labor. There was, a sort of regeneration about how we were campaigning, and like listening about Lucy Hood, we tried to put in candidates much, much earlier. It's obviously the first campaign we really, really embraced community organising, and that sort of was a program that started much earlier as well. And just a really sort of charismatic, different style of leadership as well. I'm not saying that Mally's very similar to Daniel. Obviously, they've got their own unique differences as well. But there's some thematics there that you can actually see between the two of them. And also a really good social media campaign coming out of both Mally and Daniel back in 2014. And that you need that cut through, you yourself know as a former politician and a campaigner, that to try and get people's attention in a campaign when there's so much media and so much static and noise, gets harder and harder. But I get a sense that they are getting cut through, and they're doing it in traditional ways, but also in some unique ways as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. The thing that is also different here is, of course, at the last state election, we had Nick Xenophon running in our state election. And at the beginning of the election campaign, he was the preferred premier in South Australia. So there's a whole lot of votes. And this is one of the things that I guess makes me wary of getting too excited about two-party preferred polling, statewide polling at the moment. There is a whole chunk of votes that were previously Nick Xenophon votes that we don't necessarily know where they're going to land. And if they go to a third party first, we don't really know where those preferences are going to go. So, I mean, I don't know the methodology that they've used in those polls, but I'd imagine it's pretty tricky to guess some of this stuff. Because that was a really big factor. And we've probably more than most places had a bit of a culture of minor parties, that, you know, those third parties, whether it was Nick Xenophon being so successful, getting, you know, multiple Senate seats. Of course, South Australia is the birthplace of Family First, and Family First have reformed. Two previous Labor ministers have started up Family First again and are running at this election, running candidates in marginal seats. So, you know, just predicting where some of these things are going to fall. In the poll, there is still a significant other vote. So, you know, where that lands is going to make the difference in some of these seats.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that myself, like, is that 15%, those 15 points right now, are they just parking their vote and then they'll decide? But this poll's come out pretty late in the game, right? I mean, pre-poll's been going for a while, so people are probably going to the polls now, and people are going to the polls and voting. And for a poll to still say 15% other tells me either they still haven't made up their mind, or they actually are going to, their primary vote is actually going to be for an independent or not one of the two major parties. And the Green primary seemed reasonably high as well compared to what it was at the last state election as well.
Well, I was speaking to one of the Greens candidates the other day who thought that there was a really good feel on the ground. He predicted that he thought that they would do better than they thought previously. But, you know, who knows? We've all got theories. I should disclose I'm actually the worst person I think I've ever met at reading the mood and trying to predict what it means. I've been in tears at polling booths where I was convinced that I was about to be wiped down and lose my own seat because things just felt so bad. But, you know, we don't know a lot of these things. You know, the one other thing which I think is relevant in this state election, which might be a bit different from elsewhere, is that the question of leadership itself, I would almost put as a campaign issue. We talk about health and education and the economy. We don't normally have the issue of leadership, but this is something that came out of the way COVID was managed here. Essentially, control of running the state was handed over to the COVID Management Committee. So all of the hard decisions quite often were announced by the Chief Health Officer, or more regularly as by the Police Commissioner, who's got the powers essentially to run the state still at the moment. And it was interesting because it's strange going through a time of such turbulence. And when you look at the press conferences, you see your Premier in the background, nodding in the background, not at the forefront making the calls. And so I think that's hurt him in a way that COVID might not have hurt other leaders. That, you know, people, whether they agree or disagree with the decisions that are being made, want to know that, you know, their leader is leading and is making the decisions and making the hard calls and backing them up and justifying them. And I think Stephen Marshall, rightly or wrongly, and people probably have different views, but vacated that space to unelected officials for a long time. And I think that that's one of the areas where he's been judged really harshly by the South Australian community.
I mentioned that Michael Maguire and I spoke about that in the last episode. I was, you know, I think one day during lockdown, I flipped over to, when you're watching the ABC, Daniel's 6-hour press conference had just ended, and then they flipped over to Marshall, and watch him just get up and go, "Hi, my name's Stephen Marshall, and now I'm going to hand it over to the Chief Health Officer." And that was it. Never saw him again. I was like, what is going on here? This is insane. Here is your opportunity to actually build a reputation and build a relationship with an audience directly. I mean, that's one of the great things about it. Like him or not like him, Daniel was speaking directly to the Victorian people every day for 150 days in a row, and then obviously a lot more after that as well. But this missed opportunity, it just baffles me. I feel like he's not up to it. He doesn't want the job.
Well, you know, maybe. I think in this particular case, I think the optics were so bad, it would be better if he wasn't there a lot of the time. But to have all the news grabs with, like I was a marginal seat holder. I've done my share of standing behind a leader nodding in press conferences. But that's fine if you're a marginal backbencher. But when that's the image that people see of their premier day after day after day, then I think that does start to build into that preferred premier polling. Whereas, you'd see Peter Malinauskas stand up, even if he was commending the government, if he was commentating on, the latest developments, if he was putting forward constructive suggestions, you heard directly from him that he was going to own that space. And I think it's interesting. Peter and the opposition have supported the government and their management of COVID up until last year, when Peter suggested that if he was the premier, he would actually lead the COVID management committee, whatever their proper title is, that he would be accountable for it and that he would lead. And I think that's what people wanted to hear. Whether you're traditionally Liberal or Labor, I think when times are uncertain, you want to know that there's someone leading who's going to make the tough calls. And, maybe that's what the poll results that we've seen today indicate.
Well, it's going to be a fascinating election night. Do you want to? I know you said before that you're the worst person to ask in terms of predictions, and I think you're being harsh on yourself. I do recall in 2006 you told a journalist that Labor would shit it in, but you didn't think they were going to actually write on the paper. You were right; they did shit it in. Do you want to make any predictions on any of those seats, or broadly speaking, how do you think Labor's going to go on election night?
No, I feel like that could be really unlucky. I don't want to, I'm kind of at that point where we're close enough to polling that every superstition you've ever momentarily had, I'm just holding on to. So I don't want to jinx anything. But I would say I would just say that I think the South Australian Labor Party, the candidates, and the campaigners and the party office team should really be commended. They've done a remarkable job. And hopefully it's a job that will have us celebrating on Saturday night. The one other thing I'd say is there was a real fear down here that we wouldn't get a result on Saturday night as a result of we've got many more postal votes than we normally would have. And there was a fear that pre-poll numbers would be much higher than they have been previously, and none of those votes are being counted on election night. So we certainly hope that's a story for another day. It was a major focus of debate, and in fact the opposition tried to recall the parliament so that they could address some of these issues just around the running of the election and the counting of votes. So my hope is twofold. One, that we get a result on Saturday night, and two, that we get the result that I think Peter Malinauskas, Labor and South Australia deserve.
I hope we get a result. I'm coming over, and I'm only there for the party. I'm not, I'll hand out for a while, but really, I'm just there for good old South Australian hospitality. Pint of pale, and just celebrating. Let's hope that that's what happens. Is there? I don't want to put you on the spot. Anyone who's listening to the show that lives in South Australia, what campaign should you jump on if you want to help out?
I think jump on any campaign. As it stands, we've kind of talked about the four closest seats, but there are a few seats that are much higher margins that people are feeling increasingly optimistic about. And there are some amazing candidates who are running. For any Student Unity listeners out there, Alex Dighton is now running in the seat of Black, and that is amazing. He is he is a great guy, would be a great asset to the parliament, and has a really big job to knock off a minister who's on a fair enough margin. But these are the kind of seats that, if we can get those first four over the line, if we can pull a couple of these other seats, then that would be an amazing result. For everyone, but also for Alex, who I think really deserves it. So go for one of the four most marginals, but after that, if they don't need you, go and help a great candidate, and let's see if we can, it'd be nice to have some pleasant surprise announcements on the night as well.
It would be fantastic. I love Alex Dighton, and I'm so glad.
But I love Alex Dighton too. We should have talked about him more.
He's a great bloke. Rightio, Kate Ellis, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Good luck to Labor on Saturday, and hopefully we'll have a celebratory beer on Saturday night.
Sounds great. Let's hope so.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.